All right, so let's get started making empties here. So I'm going to set this at random, and we already have our default cube. So let's just go ahead and make this our first constraint. So here's our cube. I'm going to scale it down, and then I'm going to scale it along the Z. I'm going to scale it down a little bit more, and then I'm going to copy it and move it along the Y, and then move it along the Z. And this is going to be our fixed constraint, and it's basically supposed to kind of look like two lapped together plates. So kind of like welded together plates. So I'm going to join them together so that they're one mesh, and I'll just reset their origin. And I'm just going to zero out their location. So here's our fixed constraint. I'm going to call it hashtag fixed. And there it is. I'm going to move it along here. And now we need to set it up as a fixed constraint. So if I go here to rigid body constraint, it won't allow me to do it because I don't have any rigid bodies. So let's create a rigid body here. And we're going to actually use this rigid body quite a bit. So we're going to ultimately be designing suspension systems. And typically on a vehicle, on each axle, you have a suspension system, and each suspension system will a lot of times have a subframe. We're actually going to use the subframe later. So let's make a subframe, and it's going to act as the controller for each axle that we make. And this will be obvious throughout the course. So I'm going to scale it out, and then scale it along the Y some, just kind of make it like this flat thing. We scale it a little bit less along the Y, so something like that. So let's call this double underscore subframe. Okay, and we'll make it a rigid body. And it doesn't really matter what the settings are right now. We'll have to change that later. All right, so we have our fixed constraint. Let's make a ball joint now. So when I make a ball joint, I like to make it with a sphere. So let's make an icosphere. I'm going to scale it down some, move it along the Y, about right there. And then I'm going to move my cursor to that object, and then I'm going to make a cylinder on top of that. So cylinder, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger diameter, and then I'm going to scale it along the Z like this. So there is my ball joint. So I'm going to join it together, and I'm going to call it hashtag ball joint. And we need to make it a rigid body constraint. Now we could make it a point constraint, but I actually don't like to do that. It can cause some just weird rotational problems. I like to kind of limit the rotation. So I'm going to make it just a generic spring. I'm going to put 0 for all the linear limits. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. But for some of the angles, the X and Y angle, I'm going to just leave it at, just give it a little bit of stiffness and damping. So I'm going to put this at 1 and this at 1. Okay, and then it'll be freely to rotate about the Z, which is the vertical. All right, let's make another constraint. So we have a ball joint and a fixed constraint. Let's make the next one, which is going to be an axle. So I'm going to make a cylinder. Let me move it along the Y. I'm going to scale it down, and I'm going to rotate it about the Y-axis 90. Let me scale it down just a little bit more, and then scale it along the X, like that. And then I'm going to create another one. Let me move my cursor here, and then Shift-A, mesh, make another cylinder, rotate it about the Y, 90. I'm going to scale it down to about this size, scale it along, or move it along the X, and then scale it along the X. So it's kind of like that. Make it a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to add a mirror modifier. And we'll do about the Z, not the X. And I'm going to apply this. And then I'm going to join all these objects together. Okay, and then recalculate its origin. So it's in the center. And there we go. So this is going to be our axle. And again, hopefully this looks kind of intuitively like an axle would. I'm just trying to do simple shapes. Doesn't really, of course, it doesn't matter what they look like. And these are not going to be in the rigid body world. These are not going to be rigid bodies, so they're not going to be, it doesn't matter if they intersect with anything. They're not going to have a mass or anything applied to them. So this is going to be hashtag axle. And we're going to come down here and make it a rigid body constraint. It's going to be a hinge, and that's all we need to do. So of course, this is going to be used for, you know, wheels, wheel axles, and some of the inboard connections for like the control arms. All right, let's make the next thing. So I'm going to do Shift A, and I'm going to make a cube, move it along the Y, about right there, scale it down to about that size. I'm going to move my cursor there, and then I'm going to scale it along the X. And then I'm going to make another, I'm going to copy this one, press Escape. I'm going to scale it a little bit, and then scale it quite a bit down along the X. This is going to be a slider. And the idea is that this box can kind of slide inside of that box, and that's all it can do, just move linearly. So let's join these together. Object, join, and there's our slider. We'll move it down a little bit more. So let's name it, hashtag slider. There we go. And we need to make it a rigid body constraint, and it's going to be a slider. Okay. All right, let's make the next one, which is going to be a linear spring. For that, I'm going to make a plane. I'm going to move it along the Y. I'll just go ahead and move my cursor there. And I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to press M to collapse everything, all 4 of these vertices to the center. So now I just have one point. I'm going to move it along the X to about right here. And we're going to give it a modifier. And the modifier is going to be a screw modifier. This is going to give us our helix, give it the shape of a helix like a spring has. So we want to offset that a little bit. And then we want a few iterations. So maybe something like that. All right, now we want to get out of that, and we want to convert it to a curve. So now we have it as a curve, which means we can use this curve properties menu. And we come down here to geometry. We can go down to bevel, and we can give it a depth, which is going to give it a thickness. So let's give it a depth about like that or so. And we probably also want to fill in the caps like that. Okay. All right, so there's our spring. Except we want to do one more thing, and that's convert it to a mesh now. So now we have this mesh. Let's just move it down. So I'm just going to move in edit mode. I'm going to select all of them and move everything down so that it just kind of looks like it's centered. So about right there. All right, so now we have our spring. I might scale it down a little bit. About right there. All right. Now so this is our spring. So let's call it that. It's going to be a linear spring. So linear spring. And we need to give it rigid body constraint properties. We'll do generic spring. And the only thing we want is Z-axis. Okay.